I would ask you, consent to use oversized charts on the floor today because basically the information I have won't fit into a standard size chart and still be readable.
Is there objection? So ordered.
Thank you. In a very short period of time, we're going to be considered an increase in the debt limit. And it's for a specific period of time, but it's at a minimum going to be $500 billion. And what is in front of our country, especially as we see negative growth in the third quarter, as reported today, and continued printing of money by the Federal Reserve, there's no accountability to rein in either the size, the scope, or the spending of the federal government. And over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to very succinctly outline $1.35 trillion worth of spending reductions that I would imagine the vast majority of Americans would agree with me on. And I'm going to build the case almost every day as I come out here on why we can't keep doing what we're doing and show the case, basically the case of stupidity for how the federal government is running today. I know I will have no chance to defeat an increase in the debt limit that's coming forward. I don't expect to accomplish that. The votes are here to raise the debt limit and not do anything about our spending. But most Americans realize that the federal government's twice the size it was 11 and a half years ago. Twice the size. And since the last 4 years, the average family income has declined over 7.5%. So while family income is declining, our deficits are rising, our debt is now at almost $16.5 trillion. We're projected to spend $1.3 trillion more than we take in this year. And we have the claims by the president and others that we've already cut something from the federal government. The fact is, that's only with Washington accounting. And as somebody with a degree in accounting and understanding generally accepted accounting principles, what I want America to know is the federal government is bigger right now than it was last year this time. We've not spent $1 less than we were spending last year this time. Matter of fact, we've spent about $18 billion more. Now, is that an improvement? Yes. But the claims that we've cut, $2.7 trillion from the budget, are absolutely bogus. There's no truth in it. There's no reality in it. And all you have to do is look at the amount of money we're borrowing to recognize that. So what I want to do today is to lay out in sequential fashion 5 areas where we can, in fact, make significant changes in the federal budget, start truly addressing our problems that will, in fact, have an impact of over $1.3 trillion over the next 10 years. Now, that doesn't solve our problem immediately. But if, in fact, we do that, what we have done is start down a long road of making the hard decisions. And the decisions I'm going to outline today are not hard. They're the easy ones. But we're starting down a road to get our country back and to secure the future of the young people that are sitting right down here and their children, and the expectation that opportunity could be alive and well in America. And there is coming a debt bomb. There will become a time in which the world will not loan us additional dollars. And when that happens, the consequence of that is rising interest rates. The Fed will no longer be able to control interest rates. And the interest rate will end up being whatever it takes, whatever the people of the world have in terms of what they require to loan us money. And if you just go back to historical interest rates, our average over the last 50 years on what we borrow at, the cost per year for the debt that we have today not after the additional $500 billion at a minimum we're going to increase with this debt limit, will be an additional $640 billion per year added to our must-pays coming from Congress. And once that starts, if we've made none of the adjustments, none of the changes, none of the choices of eliminating some of our wasteful and profligate spending, the next year, it adds another $150 billion on top of that. So now we're adding $700, and pretty soon we're in the spiral where the debt bomb explodes. That's the last place we want to go. And the reason it's the last place we want to go is because the very wealthy aren't going to be harmed by that. The middle class will be destroyed. And the lower class, with all the programs that we have to support them, we won't even be able to fund those. So it is imperative that we no longer just have words. It is time for us to act. I know the administration doesn't agree with that. I know a lot of my colleagues on the other side do agree with it, but won't offer up the courage that's going to be required to make the tough choices in this country. We just increased tax rates in this country $600 billion over the next 10 years. I voted for that bill. But the problem isn't revenues. The problem is the size and scope of the federal government. And I want to spend just a little bit of time on showing you what the GAO, not Tom Coburn, not my oversight, not my research, but what the GAO has said about where we are in terms of stupidity and duplication. And so I asked permission for these oversized charts because the detail behind them cannot be seen unless you have it on a chart this side. And so I just go through these rather quickly so the American people can get a little bit of a flavor of the programs that we have. We have 15 different programs run by 13 different agencies in the federal government that cost $30 million to teach financial literacy to the American people. Now, number one, I don't think that falls within the enumerated powers, but let's assume it does. Why in the world would we have 15 sets of administrators, 15 sets of overhead to spend $30 million? It makes no sense whatsoever. So let's assume that that's a role for the federal government. I disagree that it is. But why not one program, and if you take away the overhead, you'd spend exactly the same amount of money teaching financial literacy and you wouldn't waste it on overhead. So we could cut the savings, just from this one simple program is $15 to $20 million a year. The way you get to $1 billion is $1 million at a time. And the way you get to $1 trillion is $1 billion at a time. Take the next program, green buildings. We have 94 separate programs run by federal government agencies from 11 different agencies spending $1 billion on green programs. Now, there's nothing wrong with incentivizing green building. But anybody with any common sense has to ask the question, why the federal government needs 94 separate programs to incentivize green building, and why we need to run it through 11 different agencies instead of one, and why we need to have 11 sets of overhead, administration, and costs associated with it. It makes no sense at all. Next one, housing assistance. We have 160 programs. Nobody in the country knows all the programs. Nobody in the administration. I'm probably the only one in Congress that does, because nobody else has looked at it. 20 different agencies. We're spending $170 billion. If we're really interested in housing assistance, why would we have 20 sets of overhead, 20 sets of administration? And what would it cost to accomplish the same thing? All these numbers come from the Government Accountability Office, by the way. They don't come from me. And the other part of the report is that nobody knows if these programs are working. We have no data to say that the 160 programs that we're actually making a difference on housing assistance through this expenditure of money. So we're not even asking the most basic questions that a prudent person would ask is, in fact, if it's our role in housing assistance, do we know that what we're doing is working? And the GAO says you can't tell. There's no metrics on it. So no wonder we have 160 programs, because the first time somebody sees that there's another need out there, rather than reform and oversight the programs we have, we just create another one without ever looking at our housing programs. Department of Justice grants. Now, the Department of Justice is the only agency in the federal government that if they don't spend all their money every year, they get to keep it. Most people don't know that. They have 253 different grant programs. And outside of the Department of Justice, there's 9 other agencies that are involved in that. Most of them, these programs, these grant programs, have no metrics, no measurement on them whatsoever to say whether or not they are actually accomplishing the purpose that Congress created for them in the first place. So if, in fact, a prudent person would say, we have these grant programs, what are they doing? What are they supposed to do, and how are they measuring up? We don't know. Because we don't require the federal government to measure the effectiveness of their programs. If, in fact, it's a legitimate role for the Department of Justice and these 10 other agencies to grant taxpayer dollars to all sorts of state-based criminal, defense, prison, police force, investigative, if in fact that's a federal role, which again, I would go back to the Constitution and the enumerated powers and ask a question, which I think about half of these would fail in. But if it is, why would we have this many different grant programs? Why would we have this much overhead? Why would we have absolutely zero measurement on whether or not they're actually accomplishing their goal? So just where we've been so far, just so we can know, we have $176 billion worth of spending that is wastefully spent. It's duplicative. One overlaps the other, and we have no knowledge whatsoever about what we're doing. We know from our heart we're trying to accomplish good, but we have no capability to measure what we're doing. And that's just the first 4. Look at diesel emissions. We all want clean air. Why would we have 14 different separate programs on diesel emissions run through 3 different agencies? Why not have 3? One for agriculture, one for routine surface transportation, and one for stationary. That's all there is out there. There's transportation, there's agriculture, and there's stationary. And yet we have 5 times as many grant programs as we have utilization. I hope America can see how incompetent we are as we continue to allow all these things to continue. We're going to raise the borrowing against your children in less than a week. We're going to raise the borrowing against your children, and we're not going to do anything to fix these problems. Nothing. Nada. Early learning and child care. We have 50 different programs, 9 different agencies. We spend $16 billion on it. Employment assistance for disabled individuals. This is job training for disabled people. 50 different programs run through 9 different agencies. And we're going to spend $16 billion on it. I think that's an appropriate thing for us to be involved in. But why in the world would we have 50 different training programs for the disabled? Nobody can answer that. There won't be a person come to the floor and answer the question of why we have 50. What we continue to do is treat the symptoms of our disease and not the real disease. We're going to argue we should have training programs for the disabled. But we're going to deny the fact that the training programs for the disabled that we have oftentimes are marginally working, and that if we streamlined them and focused them, we'd get a whole lot more value for our money, and we'd also save money just in the overhead associated with it. Employment assistance, surface transportation programs, 5 different agencies. Now, we have a transportation bill every year. It's $40-some billion, $43 billion. And yet we take that money, which, by the way, isn't being adequately funded. We're stealing from other things to keep the transportation funding alive. And we run it through all this bureaucracy rather than say, we took the money from the states, it's for highways, mass transit, and give it back to them and let them prioritize it themselves. Instead, we consume it, a good portion of it here. We put all sorts of mandates on what they can and can't do with their own money that we collect from them and send it back to them, and then we run it through 5 different federal agencies. So they're jumping through 5 agencies' hoops just to be able to spend their own money, their own tax money. Support of entrepreneurs. I can guarantee you this one doesn't fit in the enumerated powers of the Constitution. So we have 53 times we've said, we don't care what the Constitution says. We're going to go out and support entrepreneurs. It's not a role for the federal government. We're terrible at it. We don't know what we're doing at it. And yet we have 53 programs running from 4 agencies, $2.6 billion a year. And the vast majority of it's waste and ineffectively spent. STEM education programs. This is science, technology, engineering, and math. It's an area we need to work. It's an area we need to incentivize. 209 different programs, 100 of which or more are in the Defense Department. 209? 209 programs to incentivize science, technology, engineering, math? How about a couple of ones that really work, that really create the incentives that people will really go after, that you can really manage and measure whether or not they're effective? $3.1 billion a year. So you can see, this is just the first of what the GAO has so far outlined at a request of my office, which became a law, which forced GAO to have to do it. Just a little history on this. 3 years ago, I asked the Government Accountability Office, the Government Accounting Office, and Congressional Research Services, tell me every program of the federal government. And both of them said, impossible, we can't do it. Congressional Research Service, we can't do it. We do not have the capability of doing it. So I put into statute a law mandating that the Government Accountability Office, over a period of 3 years, will identify and seek out every federal program and notify Congress where they overlap. So that's how we've gotten this information thus far. In April of this year, we'll get the last third. There's no doubt in my mind at all that we're wasting at least $200 billion a year through duplication coming from the federal government. Well, think about that for a minute. If I'm right, and I dare anybody to come down here and challenge me on it, that's $2 trillion over the next 10 years. That's 18% of our deficit this year. So the question you have to ask is, where is Congress? Why aren't they doing something on this? We've passed one bill out of the Senate in the last 3 years associated with this, got thrown out in conference, and it saved $5 billion. We could easily save 20 or 25, 30 with minimal work. I know it's much greater than that. There'll be controversy as you go up. But the fact that we've done nothing addressing these issues tells you that there is a problem in Congress in terms of facing reality. It also tells you that there's a problem in Congress in that the political is much more important than the country. That we dare not offend anybody that is a partaker of any of these programs, especially the people that are employed in the administration and implementation of these programs. Even though some programs have 250 or 209 different programs. We've met the enemy, and the enemy is the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress. Let me go to the next list. Unmanned aircraft programs. There's no question in terms of our war fighting and our intelligence services that our unmanned capability has been a tremendous asset to us. But somebody needs to ask the question, why do we have 15 different sets of programs run from 5 different agencies costing us $37 billion over 5 years? Where's the explanation for that? Where's the idea that we might concentrate expertise in 1 or 2 areas, or 3 areas, or 4? But to have 15 separate programs means we're wasting money and getting less out of the research and less out of the dollars we invested than if we were to streamline those programs and limit them to targeted objectives. But we refuse to do that. Domestic food assistance, 18 different programs, 3 agencies. Homeless programs, 21 different programs, 7 agencies, $2.9 billion. Transportation services for transportation disadvantaged persons. That's something we ought to be involved in. I don't have any problem with that. But 80 programs, each with their own overhead, each with their own set of rules that communities have to comply with, why would we not want to say, how do we make this 20 programs, make it more effective, eliminate the overhead, and save the difference? We don't have to cut money. What we have to do is save money. And we can have exactly the same result through efficiency and smart planning by eliminating duplication. In my hometown, there's 7 different programs for transportation for these people that you can access. Lapping over each other. It's not that we shouldn't be doing it, but what about the saving? Are we in a crunch or not? Are we going to continue to stick our heads in the sand and say we don't have a difficult time in front of us in terms of our financing the basic needs for our federal government? You know, we're less than 8 years away where Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt will consume every penny of tax revenue this country has. Less than 8 years away, if we make it that long before we have hyperinflation. So why would we not, in Congress, start addressing these very real needs? Job training and employment. 47 different programs, $18 billion a year, 9 different agencies. In the House, Subcommittee Chairwoman Virginia Foxx last year, I think, took about 35 of these programs and converted them into 6. She didn't look at all of them because she didn't have the authority or jurisdiction in her committee. It's the only thing that has been done in the last 3 years that addresses anything that the GAO has said. And yet we won't even take it up. Saving billions of dollars a year and improving job training programs. yet we won't take it up. Not a priority for the HELP committee. Teacher quality. 82 different programs. 82. We have 82 programs to improve the quality of teachers. And remember, we have a Department of Education, but nine other agencies have teacher improvement programs. Why would you have agencies outside of the Department of Education running teacher improvement programs? Because some congressman or senator wanted a program named after him? Or they saw a need and didn't want to put it in with the other one, so we expanded it, and so we expanded overhead, we expanded the costs, and we decreased the efficiency. I would also make note that Thomas Jefferson, his inaugural address, addressed the American people when it came to the federal government with education. Here's what he said. In order for the federal government to be involved in education, you must make an amendment to the United States Constitution. Now, I don't know a greater authority other than maybe Madison Monroe on the Constitution, but here's one of the authors of it. And in his own inaugural address as President of the United States, said we have no business being in education. And just so I might enlighten my colleagues and the American people, since the Department of Education was founded, we've spent in excess of $2 trillion of federal taxpayer money on education. And there is not one parameter that you can measure that is better than when we started. Not one. You cannot find one parameter that's better than when we started. So there was wisdom in our founders. We have great hearts, but we're not very good at some things. And this is one of them that we're not very good at. And yet here we have 82 different programs from 10 different agencies. Food safety, a legitimate role for the federal government. Legitimate. We've done some work improving food safety in the last few years. But we have multiple agencies. Do you realize that if you buy a cheese pizza, that the FDA doesn't have any control over that? But if you buy a meat pizza, the FDA controls the food quality on that. But a cheese pizza, that's FDA. So the agricultural department takes care of one pizza, and the FDA takes care of another one. Does that make any sense to anybody in America? And yet we don't have one agency totally responsible for food safety in this country. Instead, we have 15 different agencies with 30 different programs, and the cost of food goes up. Not because we're markedly improving food safety, but we're markedly increasing the regulations and requirements from 15 different agencies. So there's all sorts of hidden costs in this as well. Military and Veterans Health Service. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. We have a Pentagon, and we have a Veterans Administration. 2 agencies. But we have 4 different agencies involved in veterans and military health care. Why is that? Can anybody explain that? What is the purpose of that? Why do we have 3 different sets of rules and regulations within the Pentagon for health care? One for the Army, one for the Navy, one for the Air Force, all of them different. They're still taking care of the same diseases among the same group of people, but we have a bureaucracy. Rather than one organization running that, we have 3 giant organizations running that. How stupid is that? Is that pride of keeping everything within the Air Force or in the Navy or in the Army? When we're facing $1.3 trillion deficit this year, that's what it's going to be at a minimum. Why would we not streamline that? Why wouldn't we ask the hard questions? Why wouldn't we do the things aligned with common sense and prudence instead of a political spoils system? Economic development, 4 different agencies, 80 separate programs, tons of waste, tons of duplication, tons of overlap, tons of fraud. You see, when you have 80 programs or 85 programs and the bureaucracies can't manage them, the gamers come in. The federal government this year will create over $800 billion worth of grants. I want you to think about that for a minute. Somewhere between a fourth and a fifth of our budget will go out of here in terms of grants. There's only one agency that oversees their grants effectively and smartly. The rest of the grants are totally not overseen effectively. We work at it a little bit. So you think about it, 1/5 of the federal budget is running out of Washington in terms of grants that have requirements on them, that have timelines on them, that have specifics on them, and nobody's watching. And so you know what happens when you go to look at those? What you find is fraud, mismanagement, some accomplishing exactly what they were supposed to, but not in the time. Some under budget, but the money never gets sent back to the federal government. Some grant money that goes out that the penny's never spent and it's locked out there so it's never recaptured. There's hundreds of billions of dollars of grant money sitting out there that's never going to be used, that's never been pulled back to the federal government. Why is that? That means hundreds of billions of dollars we're going to borrow because we have money sitting idle that we don't manage effectively. Well, let me just do the third one, and then I'll wind up here a little bit, and I'll come back tomorrow and talk on some of the details of these. Here's the third sheet, and I suspect when we get the report April 1st of this year from GAO, I'll have another 2 sheets. So when you start adding up this money, you get real money. You know, you get hundreds of billions of dollars that we're wasting, but nobody's working on it. Reducing reliance on petroleum fuel for the federal fleet. We have 20 different agencies working on that, but we only have 5 programs. So we got 20 sets of bureaucrats and administrative and everything else for 5 programs for the federal. We're spending, it's not a lot of money in terms of Washington money, but fuel efficiency for the federal fleet. I mean, we put in new CAFE standards. I mean, we could replace this $50 million and say you won't buy an automobile that doesn't have X mileage. You'll limit trips. You can do lots of management things to eliminate the need for a program like this just through sound management and proper management. Electronic health record systems for veterans and military. Now, the VA has a pretty good program. You got 2 different agencies, the VA and the military, the Pentagon. You got 10 separate programs. Now, we're spending all this money at the Pentagon right now on electronic medical records when we have a system already at the VA that they could have adopted. And are we just doing one? No. We're doing a different one for each branch of the service. It makes you want to throw your hands up and get sick to your stomach when you think about what we're doing today that we should stop doing so we protect the future of this country. Let me just go through these. Here's an area that I've looked at closely, preparedness grants. Remember when FEMA was started 10, 11 years ago? When Homeland Security, or maybe 15 years ago? But preparedness grants We built all this up so we could prepare for catastrophes, right? Well, we've been doing this a number of years, well over a decade, maybe almost 2. Why do we continue to need more preparedness grants? And I haven't done this yet, but we plan on going back to look at all the money that's gone out for preparedness. But, you know, we just passed a Sandy bill that 64% of the money is going to be spent on preparedness and mitigation for the future on 50-year events. And yet we're continuing to spend money every year on preparedness. You know, is there ever a time in which you get prepared that we could stop spending money? I mean, that's a question that the average American would probably ask. Is there a point in time when you've prepared enough? Or can you spend enough money to totally prepare against anything? And of course, the answer is no. So how much is enough? How much is prudent given our budget situation today? So anyhow, I think you can see just from this limited words, and this is just one section of what I'm going to be talking about, duplication. I'm going to be talking about health care. I'm going to be talking about the Defense Department. Republicans have a blind eye to the waste in the Defense Department and the mismanagement and the duplication and the swinging revolving door from retired military officers to the very companies that end up getting the contracts that pay their salaries to get another contract to keep going on things that necessarily are not priorities. Let me just take an example here for a moment, if I can. Actually, this is the best one. Here's a green building. Here's all the programs on green buildings. Anybody think that makes sense? That's why we had to have a chart this big, because it's absolutely asinine what we're doing. The duplication of what we're doing through multiple different departments in terms of incentivizing green buildings. Just think about if you just had 5 or 10 people in the administration of each one of these programs, what you would save if you ended up just having 5 or 6 programs. What would what would the benefit be that would inure through the years in terms of the compounded savings for our kids and young people in this country? So when you look, here's green building. You got the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have, I think, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 programs. You have the Department of Health and Human Services. They have multitude of programs. You have the Department of Agriculture, has multitude of programs. The Department of Transportation. They have multiple programs for green buildings. Why don't we have a green building department in the federal government and just have one and save the overhead and save the money? Environmental Protection Agency, you can see all their programs throughout. This is lunacy. It's craziness. So I'm going to stop with that, but I have this comment for my fellow Oklahomans and fellow Americans. The next time you hear from a member of the U.S. Congress that we can't cut spending, have them play this C-SPAN tape back for you. Either they don't want to, or they know nothing about management or efficiency or common sense. There's no longer excuse to say we can't get marked savings from our federal government. And as I go through this the next couple of weeks, I'm going to show example after example after example. It is painful to say the greatest nation in the world is absolutely incompetent when it comes to managing its bureaucracy, its programs, and its money. But that's a true statement. And I'm going to show evidence over the next 2 weeks of just how incompetent we are. But I hope to build the case that no member of Congress can ever tell a constituent again that we can't cut spending. and that we can't cut significant spending, at least $2 trillion, just from duplication. Just from duplication over the next 10 years. The work of government is hard. The work of Congress is built on compromise. But there's no longer going to be a bogus set of facts out there that we cannot cut spending. Because I'm going to prove that we can, and then it's going to be on the onus on the rest of the members of the body to say why they're not. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.